We're going to explain how to resolve the Firebase app named default already exists error in both Flutter and React Native. This frustrating error crops up when you've inadvertently initialized Firebase more than once in your application. Let's tackle this problem systematically. 1. Understanding the root cause. This error means your code has called Firebase.in_initialize_app, or its equivalent depending on your Firebase services, multiple times. This typically happens due to multiple imports of Firebase, possibly in different parts of your application, like multiple screens importing Firebase independently, or because you're initializing Firebase within a function that gets called more than once. 2. Flutter solution. In Flutter, meticulously examine your main.dart and other files where you're using Firebase. Ensure Firebase is initialized only once, preferably in your main function, before any other widgets or services access it. If you're using multiple Firebase services, for example Firestore, authentication, and real-time database, it's sufficient to initialize Firebase just once. Check your imports, eliminating redundant ones. Make sure that the Firebase configuration JSON file, google-services.json, is correctly placed in the Android app directory for Android, and within the iOS runner directory for iOS. Double-check your Android/app/build.gradle, and iOS pod file for correct configurations, making sure there aren't conflicting dependencies. 3. React Native solution. In React Native, the situation is similar. Confirm that you're only importing the Firebase packages you need and are initializing Firebase only once, usually in your app's entry point. Ensure your google-services.json, Android, and Google service-info.plist, iOS are correctly placed. For Android, you need to apply the Firebase config to your app level, build.gradle, file. For iOS, you'll need to integrate the Firebase configuration properly into Xcode by linking the libraries in your pod file and making sure you've handled dependencies correctly. If you are using multiple components that require Firebase and each calls initialize app, you can create a single instance of your Firebase client and pass it around to the different components that need it, thus preventing multiple initializations. If you're still stuck, carefully review your project structure, focusing on where and how you're importing and using Firebase. 4. Conditional initialization. A robust solution is to use a conditional initialization check. Before calling Firebase.initialize_app, check if Firebase is already initialized. Many Firebase SDKs provide a method to check this. For instance, in some Firebase SDKs, you might use Firebase.app.length0, or a similar function to check if a Firebase app is already initialized, and only call initialize app if it's not already initialized. This prevents errors even if your application accidentally tries to initialize Firebase multiple times. Thorough debugging by using console logs to track your Firebase initialization process might be necessary to pinpoint the exact location causing the error. Remember to restart your app or emulator after making any changes to your project configuration.